Go.
Hey, let me welcome everyone here today, 4th of April, 2023. My name is Mark Kramer. I am the Director of Cold War Studies and host regular Cold War Studies seminars. I also host Sakharov seminars on human rights, and today's seminar is in the Sakharov series. And I am particularly pleased to welcome here a courageous individual who really follows in the legacy of Andrei Sakharov, Denis Skopin, who until last October was an associate professor of political science at St. Petersburg State University in Russia. St. Petersburg State had already had some ups and downs going back to 2021, I believe it was, when a joint arrangement with Bard College in New York had been abruptly canceled for reasons that were never made clear, but at least publicly. And but much more important in terms of events that affected Denis directly was the war that began on the 24th of February, 2022. And he, after President Putin announced the mobilization on the 21st of September of last year, there were protests in St. Petersburg, including students, but also there were a few courageous individuals who agreed to speak publicly about the war. And one of them was Denis Skopin, who protested both the war and the mobilization, which directly affected his students, either they were going to be called up while students or after they were done. So but again, it's been somewhat dispiriting over the last year and a couple of months to watch that not that many people in Russia have spoken up. Some have, but many have, whatever they may think about the war, have chosen to remain silent. So it's always refreshing and encouraging to see that there are a few courageous individuals who actually agree to speak out. And one of these is clearly Denis Skopin. He paid for it, losing his job. He eventually had to leave Russia and is now currently based in Berlin, where he will be speaking from today. We were going to have him come to Harvard for this seminar, but because of the visa processing, we will instead have him come in the fall of this year. So I look forward to welcoming him in person later this year. He, in addition to his academic work, he is a skilled photographer and is an expert on photography in general, and has used that in his academic work, looking at photographs, for example, from the Stalin period. And in the fall, he actually will be speaking about that, about the value of photographs in understanding the Stalin period in the Soviet Union. Today, however, he is going to be talking very much about the last year and looking at political life in Russia since the beginning of the war, and in particular focusing on a funeral for Wagner Group mercenaries that he witnessed in December of last year, and will be using photographs, some of his own photographs, to illustrate that and to talk about more recent events. So with that, let me turn to Denis, and I'm very glad to welcome you here.
Okay, thank you very much for this presentation. And I would like, of course, first of all, to thank Professor Mark Kramer for inviting me to give a talk at this seminar. I'm very honored to have this possibility to share with you my knowledge and my experience. And maybe my talk will be a little bit shorter than planned, but I hope that it will be okay with you. And please let me share with you my screen. Okay. I'm sorry. I also need to share with you the sound, okay. I'm sorry, can you see my screen now?
Yes, the slides are visible.
Yes, that's true.
And you can go to slide. Yes, everything's visible.
Okay, thank you, Mark. I would like to start my talk by saying that the question that interests me, or rather the question that has obsessed me since the beginning of the war, is to know how it is possible to support this war. Who are the people who support this war? Why do they do this? What is going on in their heads? What is their physical appearance like? What is their social background? What are their customs and habits? This question is not new, of course. It has been asked by many thinkers, intellectuals, in relation to another war, the Second World War, of course. In order to obtain an answer to this question, or rather to all these questions, time at certain distance, geographical and chronological, from the events are required. But when you live in Russia, you are so deeply immersed in what is going on that you have no time, unfortunately. Things happen very fast. War speeds up all processes. You have no time to think. You only can react and do what you think is right. My research interests are at the intersection, as Mark has just said, are at the intersection of political philosophy and photography studies, focusing on photographic practices and the circulation of photographs under authoritarian regimes and dictatorships. Prior to 2022, my research was based on historical photographs I found in state archives and private collections. Since the beginning of the war, I realized that my mission, or my duty as an intellectual, was not only to reflect on the unprecedented political events taking place in my country, but also to document them. This war was a big shock for us. Nobody expected this war, and rationally thinking people understood that an invasion of Ukraine was a suicidal idea, not to mention its moral aspects, that the Ukrainian army would resist. And stupefaction and panic were the first reaction to the situation. The first days after the war were the moment when many people fled the country, just booked any flight and moved abroad. But it was also a moment of agitation when some people tried to act, to respond to the situation. And the first days and months after the beginning of the war were accompanied by an intense feeling of a historical moment. You realize that the events unfolding around you right now have a historical significance. And although I had never practiced photography, even as an amateur, I made the decision to do my own photographic project. Between the 24th of February 2022 and January 2023, I took about 1,500 photographs depicting various aspects of political life in Russia, primarily anti-war rallies and that campaign launched by the president's administration, portraits of activists who dared to speak out against the war, like this girl who was one of my students, as well as portraits of war supporters. Inspired by August Zander's Faces of Our Time series, I tried to develop and apply an approach I call political anthropology. While continuing to live in my own country, I found myself in a position of an anthropologist, looking critically at the natives and studying their customs. I'm going to show and comment on the photos I took in St. Petersburg on December 23rd, 2022, at the funeral of a Wagner Group fighter killed in Ukraine. As you probably know, the headquarters of the Wagner Group, so-called Wagner Center, are located in St. Peter. So St. Petersburg is the capital of the Wagner Group. And some photos I'm going to show were taken a bit earlier, and I use them to provide political and social context. At the same time, I don't want to look for a theory to explain what is happening in Russia. The time for theory has not yet come, in my opinion. I simply want to share my experience and knowledge with you. However, I will try to categorize the people who support the war, dividing them into several groups. It is important to understand that each of these groups has its own reason to support the war. As a researcher, I'm more interested in a general portrait of the war supporter than in the individuality of people whose photos I'm going to show. I would like to argue that this war is not the war of the whole Russian population, but that of certain social groups, which were previously marginalized. Since the first days of the invasion, it became clear that the Russian army was lacking troops. To attract potential volunteers, a mobile military recruitment point was installed on the central square of St. Petersburg. Probably one of the purposes of the installation of this recruitment point was to test the citizens' opinion and their readiness for military service under the contract. However, the result of this campaign was unexpected for the organizers and demonstrated little interest for military service. Everyone was invited to disassemble and assemble an AK-47. Many people came and played this game, but I spent about half an hour there, and the recruitment point was empty. Nobody wanted to get recruited. And when I asked them, when I asked the officer who was there if they had volunteers, he had nothing to say and just had a guilty smile in response. And the next day, the recruitment point was not there, although it had been planned. And for the majority of Russian loyalists, supporting warfare doesn't mean being ready to get recruited. Unlike in Ukraine, where people want to join the army, people in Russia can support the war, but only as spectators. I just want to remind you that all this happened before mobilization, before the mobilization campaign. Another solution for the troop shortage for Russian authorities was to rely on private military companies that would hire potential fighters using their own methods. The biggest and best known of such companies is the Wagner Group, whose mercenaries were active in West Africa, Syria, and are now fighting in Ukraine. As you probably know, Yevgeny Prigozhin is known in Russia as Putin's coup. He spent many years in prison for robbery and theft, and then became the owner of several restaurants where he served dishes personally to Putin. He first tried to recruit mercenaries by promising them a high salary, the equivalent of approximately $3,000 US. However, this didn't help to improve the situation. Shortly after that, the Wagner Group started hiring convicts from prisons. A former convict himself, Prigozhin personally came to the prisons and spoke to the inmates. On the one hand, convicts were an ideal solution to the problem of lack of troops. In case of death, the convicts would not appear on the official list of casualties. Their death would not cause any social resonance. On the other hand, it became clear that convicts were bad fighters and that Wagner Group used them as cannon fodder. The casualties among convicts are really terrible. And the funeral of the mercenary, here's his portrait, was preceded by a scandal. According to the mercenary's will, he was to be buried in St. Petersburg. The local authorities, i.e. the mayor of St. Petersburg, didn't want the slain criminal to be buried in the military sector of the cemetery with the soldiers and officers of the regular army. Prigozhin has political ambitions, and he's on very bad terms with the mayor of St. Petersburg. He's also on bad terms with the Ministry of Defense, since his group is a competitor of the official troops. And the negotiations lasted 2 weeks. The authorization to bury the convict in St. Petersburg was finally obtained. And the mercenary was to be buried in the Belo-Ostrovskaya cemetery on the outskirts of the city. This cemetery is not considered prestigious. In general, big cities, in particular Moscow and St. Petersburg, are not suffering the consequences of the war. The majority of soldiers serving under contract in the Russian military come from the poorest non-Russian regions like Buryatia and Chechnya, as well as from villages and small towns. To get recruited is the only way for them to make a living, and of course, an important social elevator. Thus, in St. Petersburg city cemeteries, there are only a few graves, those of high officers who were killed during the conflict, like this colonel, who was a military engineer killed by Ukrainian shelling when he was crossing a bridge. And this grave is in the Serafimovskaya cemetery in St. Petersburg, which is a very prestigious military cemetery where, for example, the crew of the nuclear submarine Kursk is buried. Yeah, just to give an example. But of course, most of the Wagner Group fighters killed in Ukraine are buried in the remote, buried far from big cities, and most of them are buried in the remote village of Горячий Ключ in the Krasnodar region. There are something like 600 graves there. So a mercenary's funeral in St. Petersburg was in itself an unprecedented event, of course. And when I came there, I was not sure if I would be allowed to attend the funeral. However, Prigozhin's group made the decision to make the event open, even public. The leader of the Wagner Group attended the cemetery, but early in the morning, so as not to appear in public. More than 100 people attended the ceremony. Some of them had been brought by buses reserved in advance, and the ceremony was opened by speakers. I'm going to show you the pictures of some of them. This man told me that he had Finnish nationality, and the Finnish flag he holds is supposed to demonstrate that the war is supported by a certain part of Finnish society. I have found out some information about him. It turns out that this man was born and grew up in Russia. However, later, thanks to his Finnish surname and ancestors, he managed to get naturalized in Finland, and actually he earns his living by publishing articles criticizing European politics in Russia. He presents himself as a Finnish journalist. It is important for the Russian authorities to show that they are not alone. They need allies, such as those who live in Europe but who support Russian policy. The audience of this man, who pretends to be a Finn, is in Russia. Then there are people. The funeral was attended by people who had political ambitions, like this businessman. People like him are professionals who want to benefit from the event, and in general want to benefit from the instability in the country for social promotion. Previously marginalized, this group of people, often with a criminal past, sees the war as an opportunity. The coffin was covered by two flags, those of Russia and Wagner Group. The Wagner Group slogan is honor, homeland, blood, courage. You can see it written on the flag, on the black flag. There were also simpler people who seemed to believe what they said. These were mostly women. They demonstrated empathy for the killed mercenary. For example, this old woman came to the funeral on her own initiative. She's crying. She feels sorry for the killed mercenary. The gap between two generations, the young and the old, is particularly important in Russia. Yeah, it exists everywhere, but in Russia, it's particularly important. This is a gap between those who grew up in the Soviet Union and those who grew up in today's Russia. It is a division between those who watch TV and those who don't. Russian TV, as you probably know, spreads only official information, and it is the most important source of propaganda in the country. So most of the war supporters are elderly people. It's very, very important. This woman also wanted to take a picture of the mercenary's portrait in order to keep it as a memory. Another woman made an exalted speech. There is no meaning behind what she says. She said, her speech sounds like a piece of that poetry. I tried to translate it into English. So you are bold, courageous, what dexterity, professionals of their trade, sons of the fatherland. What energy you have. I'm proud of you. Your Russian spirit, your aspiration to purify the land from fascism knows no bounds. You are superheroes. You are the best warriors in the world. How much optimism and courage you have. Think about it. Watching the battle scenes gives you goosebumps. What a talent, what a reaction. You are the superheroes of our time, and so on and so forth. Yeah, and look how she says on this.
Вы супергерои, вы лучшие воины мира, сколько в вас оптимизма, храбрости. Вы только подумайте, смотрим кадры ваших боевых действий, мураши по телу, какая сноровка, реакция.
Yeah, I hope that you can see the video. Yeah.
Yes, it was very clear. It
Okay.
came through fine. And
Okay, thank you, Mark. The man, this man in the center, the man who holds the flag, represents a veterans organization which includes participants from World War II, the Chechen War, and the wars in Afghanistan and Syria. I'm going to show another video.
В нашу организацию входят и ветераны Великой Отечественной войны, которые помогаем, ветераны боевых действий в Афганистане, Чечне, Сирии, сейчас еще вот, не знаю как назвать. От лица нашей организации я приношу соболезнования родным и близким Дмитрия, хотя я его не знал, ну как боевой офицер, я просто не имею права не почтить его память.
Okay. So toward the end of the speech, the man offers his condolences to the loved ones of the deceased. And he literally says, although I didn't know him as a combat officer, I cannot help but honor his memory. Yeah, it's a very curious fact. Indeed, who is the killed man? We can see him in this photo. Dmitry Menshikov, 31 years old, was sentenced to 7.5 years for selling drugs on the second day of the war in Ukraine, the 25th of February. He served his sentence in the Ryazan colony. It was there that Menshikov was recruited by the Wagner Group. He went to war in August and died on October 17th. Little known about his life. He was an orphan, grew up in an orphanage, and had no children. It means that condolences to Menshikov's family members offered by the speaker didn't make any sense. And this is a fairly typical biography of a mercenary in Wagner's group. Everything we know about him is from Prigozhin's talk. I'm going to quote Prigozhin. He lived in an orphanage, joined the army. He did it honestly. He didn't hide, didn't lurk, didn't ask his mom and dad to send him to Paris or Dubai or somewhere else. He just joined the army and served in the Russian National Guard. National Guard is a special police used for mass operations like the crackdown of political protests. He served in the Russian National Guard, by the way, here near St. Petersburg. After that, he decided to get married and worked as a welder. He didn't have enough money, so he decided to earn some money and went to prison. An opportunity presented itself. He wrote letters to the president, wrote to everybody. I want to go to war. I want to defend my motherland. He signed a contract. He died honestly. With a grenade launcher in his hands, he destroyed a machine gun crew. Just an ordinary infantryman with a submachine gun in his hands killed the enemy in a trench. He was hit by a bullet, bled out. Yeah, this was a quote from Prigozhin's talk. Yeah. So another group, other representatives of the patriotic media. This man told me that he worked in patriotic media. This is a strange-looking man belonging to a certain far-right subculture. Of course, we can see it clearly on the photo. But we should not underestimate the people who work in this media. A Telegram channel, Telegram is a very popular instant messenger in Russia, and but it's also a media. Yeah, so a Telegram channel with 20,000 subscribers brings in $2,000 or $3,000 US dollars per month. So it's a good source of income. And these are cynical people who benefit from the war and who are responsible for fueling the war. So you can imagine how much you can earn if you have a Telegram channel with 500,000 subscribers, followers, like the person who has just been killed in St. Petersburg, so 2 days ago, just 400 meters from my home. Yeah, so it's very, so these people are cynical people, and they are guilty for fueling the war. Yeah. This man also made a video for a patriotic channel that, he says, has 400,000 subscribers on YouTube. It's again an impressive number. This person, apparently a modest cameraman, expressed sympathy for Putin because, as he said, he's going through a difficult time right now. And it was especially difficult when he, i.e. Putin, came to power. Can you hear me? I'm sorry.
There's no problem.
Okay.
Hearing
Thank
you.
you.
It's come through fine.
Okay, thank you. I'm a little bit worried because I have weak internet connection here. Yeah, I'm sorry. Okay,
So far it's come through fine, Denis, so don't worry.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Yeah, this 18 years old man, this one, standing right, is a student, activist, and ambitious beginning politician. A few months ago, he was involved in a scandal as a member and activist of the LDPR. It's a Russian party, an official party. He threatened to physically harm other young party members for their declarations discrediting the authorities. So he threatened this, to physically harm other young party members. And because of this, and because of numerous complaints, he was expelled from this party. But shortly after that, he was invited to lead the youth club, Wagnerenok. Wagnerenok, the name of the club, means literally in Russian, a young follower of the Wagner Group, or a little Wagner. Yeah, so this club opened its doors at the Wagner Center in St. Petersburg. And this club organizes meetings of its members, high school students, with the Wagner Group mercenaries and deputies. The funeral was attended by a large number of military school students, who were brought there by bus. At the funeral, there were a large number of people in uniform wearing various chevrons, military insignia and symbols. Like this man, this one, or this young man. This man, according to what he told me, is a private person, just a private person, and the symbol on his sleeve is simply the Moscow coat of arms. Of course, things are not so simple. In Russia, as in Great Britain, St. George slaying the dragon is the symbol of far-right organizations. So it's a little bit international. Yeah. There were representatives from the veterans organizations, including that of the paratroopers. When I asked one of them, this person, second from the right, standing in the back row, so when I asked him what he thought about the tension between the military and the Wagner Group, as well as the fact that Menshikov was a convict, he literally started yelling at me. He shouted out that there was no tension and they had to fight and were fighting for one cause. And all disagreements were the result of the intrigues of the mayor of St. Peter. As I have said, Menshikov was killed long ago, but he was not buried for about 2 months because of his status as a prisoner. Yeah, so the St. Petersburg authorities refused to bury him in the military aisle of the cemetery. Yeah, and when I take photos, I try to have short conversations with the person whose photo I take in order to find out who they are, what their political opinions are, etc. And this man felt that there was something wrong with me, that I was different from the rest of the public, that my interest for this event was of a different kind. And these people can read your habitus, your social status, which is closely connected with the political opinions on the war. So they can read our social status as we can read theirs. So he was very unfriendly towards me. And I'm sorry. And of course, the funeral was attended by mercenaries from the Wagner Group. And the thing that they all have in common is that they all hide their faces. I asked this man to look into the camera so I could take a picture of him, but instead he deliberately looked away. Here another man who hides his face, and on the baseball cap of the other man, this one, he also hides his face. So on his baseball cap, you can see the emblem of the Wagner Group. Yeah, this emblem is a school. This emblem is with a school is that of the Wagner Group. Yeah, this one. He's a Wagner Group mercenary. Yeah. Another person who hides his face. Yeah, there were many of them at the funeral. And I'm going to show another video. And in this video, you also can see people with hidden faces. Okay, so the union of the former criminal with the military was marked by a military salute in his honor by a group of soldiers. So the politics of the burial right itself, especially the politics of mourning in Russia, is a very important but separate topic. But I cannot speak about it in details at the moment. In conclusion, I would like to say a few words about the role of photography in political life in today's Russia. In the 1980s, scholars stressed the nexus of photography and power. The most common view was that photography was a kind of tool for controlling, subjugating, or appropriating reality. In recent scholarly literature, the focus has shifted on how and to what extent photographic records can be independent of the photographer's intention and thus carry independent information to spectators. But the situation in today's Russia makes us look at the question differently. The situation makes clear the ability of photography to undermine official political narratives, to be disruptive and criticize. This capacity of photography to be critical comes to the fore under the regimes that restrict freedom of expression. Of course, the most effective form of resistance to the regime is direct political activism. In Russia, however, overt political activism is practically suppressed and criminally prosecuted. Taking photos of political events can constitute indirect activism. The taking of a political stand, it can be a form of action. Thank you for your attention. So I'm stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Denis. Let me, there are some questions that have been raised, but let me start just by making a couple of comments. One is, first of all, it must have been, did you at any time fear for your safety as a photographer at this funeral? You mentioned that one man who had been quite angry about, a fairly innocuous question that you asked him, and others were hiding their faces and so forth. Did you come under threat as you were taking photographs? Did you fear that they might smash your camera and take it away, or try to harm you? That's one question. And then another one about the role of photography. One thing that is quite striking is the ubiquity of that in British English, zet, or in American English, Z, the letter, which bears, fairly disturbing resemblance to a swastika. Is there any self-consciousness about that in Russia, among either the people that you encountered at that funeral, or you also had photographs from other areas in which that is, and you see these buildings with a large Z on them, or zet, and so the prominence of symbols too, which again I think come across quite well in your photographs. And with some of the Wagner slogans like honor, homeland, blood, courage, those come straight from fascist slogans, Heimat, Blut, etc. So I'm wondering, are people self-conscious about the use of these symbols, which often do convey a kind of fascistic quality to them, and especially older people, but also I was interested to see how many people were at that funeral, and quite a few young people too. So I'm wondering, what were your reactions as you were there at that funeral, taking photographs? You got a lot of really good photographs, including that man who was irritated about being photographed. But so if you could give more about your own impressions. You conveyed what you witnessed there, but I'm interested to know how you approach that event.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Mark. Thank you for your questions, which are indeed very important questions. Indeed, there were a few moments at the funeral when I felt uncomfortable, because some people were a little bit suspicious on my identity. And yes, I felt uncomfortable, but it was, and when I was realizing this photographic project in St. Petersburg, it happened to me to be threatened. For example, when I was taking a picture of the Z symbol in St. Petersburg subway, a man approached me and he started physically threaten me, yeah, and he told he was a Wagner Group fighter, things like this happened to me, but when I was just starting taking photos of these kind of people, I didn't realize how to approach them, because it's very important to approach them in the right way, to have the right way to speak with them. So when I was taking photos, I was always trying to have short dialogues with the people whose photos I were taking. Yeah, I were taking. So it was important in order to understand who they were. Yeah, and first, my way of approaching them was quite maybe ironical or even a little bit aggressive, and their reaction was aggressive as well. But maybe it was possible after the beginning of the war, in spring or in summer, to behave as I behaved, so I was challenging them a little bit, yeah. But after that, I realized that it was not safe, and maybe it was not very smart from me to behave like this, and I switched to another strategy, and I tried to introduce myself as a representative of a patriotic Telegram channel, taking photo as a journalist, or a kind of journalist, or a private person, but working for a patriotic Telegram channel, taking photos for patriotic purposes. Yeah, and it was a much better way to start the conversation and to get photos. Yeah. And yes, so it's my answer to your first question. As for the second question about parallels between some fascist symbols, swastika, and the symbols used by today's Russian authorities to promote the war, indeed, these parallels are striking. And, you know, indeed, so it's difficult to understand how people who officially fight against Nazism use such symbols for their propaganda. And indeed, you know, people who use these symbols and who are fond of these symbols, most of them are far-right people, far-right activists, and they don't care, in fact, about these similarities. So as for a broader audience, so as for the people, elderly people who watch TV and who really believe that in Ukraine, Russian military is fighting Nazis, so for them, you know, I think they just don't ask this question. So it's somewhere they don't care about. You know, this question is more complicated. They are not able to draw these parallels, I think. Yeah.
He seems to have frozen a bit. You froze for a minute, Denis. So if you
I'm
could
sorry.
repeat what you said.
Yeah, I'm saying that. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can
Okay.
hear you now.
Okay, so I'm saying that on the one hand, among people who support so-called special military operation, there are many far-right activists, and for them, the similarity between Nazi symbols and their symbols, the symbols they use, is not a problem at all, just ideologically. Yeah, they don't believe in, you know, in denazification of Ukraine, of course. Yeah. On the other hand, there is a broader audience, elderly people who watch TV and who believe in propaganda. As for them, I think that they don't ask these questions. They don't ask the questions about this striking similarity between Nazi symbols and today's Russia symbols. Yeah.
Okay. One thing I should note is until February of last year, I was coming to Russia often. I would come sometimes 4 or 5 times a year, mostly to Moscow, because I did archival research there. And you know, the archival situation up until then was very good. It was actually, even as the political situation was getting worse and worse in Russia, the archival situation was actually improving, oddly enough. And access, working conditions were really excellent. I left on the 9th of February of last year. And at that point, everything seemed pretty normal. I mean, there were certainly discussions about whether there would be a war, and the large majority of people, in fact, I think almost everyone I spoke to thought there would not be a war. You mentioned that sentiment yourself from last year. And then suddenly, you know, everything seemed to, after the 24th of February, everything seemed to go crazy. That is, you know, you have someone like Vladimir Tatarsky, who has no talent in life beyond, or had no talent in life beyond calling for the extermination of Ukrainians, and you know, and making extremely disparaging comments about people within Russia who were opposed to the war. So what produced? I don't. You know, the mentality is so strange, because as recently as 10 years ago or so, Russians often spoke fondly about Ukrainians, and you know, there were warm feelings on the part of many Russians toward Ukrainians. So how could you go from that kind of atmosphere to the you know, really crazed anti-Ukrainian genocidal rhetoric of the last year? You must have asked yourself that question looking at things in St. Petersburg, and I know you said it's still too early, and I agree with you, it's still too early to have a full explanation, but what are some of your preliminary thoughts about that, Denis?
Yes, it's indeed it's a very good question that I also ask, and I would answer. I would say that in my opinion, so today's Russian society does not support this war. I know that it sounds strange, but I would argue that this war is not the war of the Russians. It's just the war of a quite small group of people, unfortunately, who came to power. And this group of people is a minority, of course. These people managed to impose their opinions to the majority of the population. I'm speaking not only about Putin and his elites. I'm rather speaking about a group of people who were a group that was previously marginalized, like Prigozhin, and like people who attended this funeral, you know, and these people are actually, how to say, they control the situation in the country, unfortunately, and they impose their opinions to the rest of the population. I believe that in this sense, the situation is quite different from that in the Nazi Germany, where there was an official ideology shared by the majority of the population. I would say that in today's Russia, the majority of population remains indifferent to this war. They are not really concerned by this war. They are not. They don't think about it. They have their everyday problems. Like, so elderly people who support this war, they don't really think about it. They don't really want to go deep in the subject matter. They have their problems, yeah. And yeah, my answer to this question is, yeah, is that
Okay.
indeed, yeah.
Okay, very good. Thank you. I'm going to go to some questions from the audience, Denis. So I may come back eventually to a couple more questions I have. Well, let me, before I come to the audience question, you were at the recruitment office, and you showed, I think, quite convincingly that basically they weren't able to get volunteers. And what was the sentiment among your students at St. Petersburg State University? I think many people have seen the courageous speech that you gave when you were leaving the university, and your students came to be there, to say goodbye to you. But they also gave you a standing ovation when you were done, when you told them that it was no longer possible to accept the lies that you were seeing all around you, and that you found it that you really had to stand up for what you believed. So they obviously were very receptive to that message. And I'm wondering, what sorts of lessons did you draw from that recruitment office and the lack of people there? And the very fact that Prigozhin and others have gotten, a former criminal himself, as you pointed out, and have gotten involved in recruiting so heavily in prisons, suggests that that it bears out what a lot of what you said with regard to sentiment. But could you speak about, did you have any private conversations with your students, for example, about it? And I don't mean that you need to disclose exactly what they said, but or who they were, but but I mean, if you could convey what sort of, how you felt they looked on the war. People, students are a little bit older, maybe below 30.
Mhm. Okay, thank you. In this sense, I was lucky because I had excellent students who understood very well what was happening in the country. I taught at the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Sciences of St. Petersburg State University, and our faculty was different from the rest of the university. We had long-term partnership with Bard College, a liberal arts college located in Annandale in the US. And most of our students were very liberal. They were educated in the spirit of freedom, democracy, and openness. And when the war began, I just came at the faculty and I had a class, and I told to my student what I thought about the war, and they were of the same opinion. They had the same opinion about this war. All of us were equally shocked, and indeed, so I don't know, maybe I lived in my bubble, in my social bubble. So all my friends are professors, and they share my political opinions. So my students also shared my political opinions. So, and I felt quite, on the one hand, I was shocked by what was happening. On the other hand, all my friends, all my students were shocked as well. And we spoke about this a lot, including during the classes. And my students, that's why they supported me.
There has, though, been, and again, I will come to the audience questions, I promise, to the people who have raised the questions, but there is, though, this, at least, again, in public schools, maybe not at universities, but I think even at some universities, it's been this kind of return to the public Morozov mentality of informing on people who say the wrong things, turning them into the authorities. And, there have been arrests on the basis of that in public schools. I'm thinking of mostly in rural areas, but even in larger cities. So I'm wondering, did you ever wonder whether one of your students was going to betray you?
I think that unfortunately, it's possible, and what is happening now. So I think that if I continue teaching at my faculty and doing what I was doing, so I will be certainly denounced by one of my students. So the majority of them, I would say, 90% of them share my political opinions, but there are always few students who don't. And I think if I keep doing what I was doing, I will be arrested, denounced, and not arrested, but I will be denounced by one of my students for sure.
Okay, let me turn to, by the way, someone asked about who Pavlik Morozov was. So let me just that was a figure from the 1930s during the collectivization in the Soviet Union. And he revealed to the authorities that his parents were hiding grain. So he was subsequently put to death by other peasants who retaliated. But because he had reported his parents to the authorities, he became a hero in the Stalinist Soviet Union, and there were statues put up to him all over. So it's the mentality of being an informant, and informing on those who somehow deviate from what the authorities want. That's the idea. So anyway, let me go to, there are quite a few audience questions, Denise. So I'm going to give them to you one at a time, and you can, there was someone who asked to just clarify about the salary that you mentioned for the Wagner mercenary. Was that paid on a weekly basis or monthly, or how exactly was this person compensated?
I'm sorry, if I understand well, the
It
question
was
is...
just, you made a reference to the salary that the mercenary was promised. And how exactly was that paid to him? Was it paid to him during his service, or was it promised that he would receive it at the end?
It's a good question, because they complain very often about how their salary is paid. And the problem is that indeed, they quite often they don't receive the salary that they had been promised. And yeah, and most of people who get recruited, who go to Russian military, or who are recruited, hired by the Wagner Group, they go to war for money. For them, it's the main and maybe the only motivation to join the military, unfortunately. Yeah, and there are, so I think that people, that's unlike in Ukraine, in fact, because in Ukraine there are many volunteers. People really want to join the army, so it's not the same in Russia. And I believe that it's a very important sign of the real opinion among the population. So and yeah, people go there to earn money. That's the only motivation for today's Russian soldiers in Ukraine. But indeed, yeah, I can't tell you all details about the payment, but I know that very often the mercenaries or the soldiers of the Russian military don't receive the money they expect to receive.
Okay, another question would be, this person has two questions, but I'll ask them one at a time, is how are when Wagner mercenaries are buried, how are the choices in which region to bury them made? That is, do the people who were killed beforehand indicate where they want to be buried before they are sent to the front? Are they asked that when they're recruited? If they die, do they have a preference on where they want to be buried?
Okay, so the rule in this case is not to bury the mercenaries in big cities, yeah, because it's very important. It's very important for Russian authorities. For them, they don't want the war to come to the capitals, to Moscow and St. Petersburg. And if you live in Moscow or St. Petersburg, you don't see any consequences of the war. The life didn't change, just theaters, museums, bars, restaurants are open. They are full of people. In the summer, people, I don't know, people go to bars, people go to nightclubs. There are streets full of young people drinking, I don't know, smoking, listening to music, dancing. So you don't see that this country is at war. Yeah, if you are in Moscow or in St. Petersburg, but there are some villages in remote regions or in national republics like Buryatia, where many people died at this war. And I think this is a strategy adopted by Russian authorities. This war should not be visible in big cities. Yeah? And that's why the question where to bury the mercenary is a strategic question. And they try, and the administration of big cities doesn't want mercenaries to be buried in their cities. Yeah, that's the rule. That's the general strategy. And the biggest cemetery of the Wagner Group, as I said, is located in Krasnodar region. Why? Because Krasnodar region is not very far from Ukraine. And second, it's a remote town or a remote village where nobody comes. But unfortunately for the authorities and for those who set up this cemetery is actually in the focus of interest of many journalists. So many people came there, and many people came there in order to calculate the number of the graves there and to calculate the number of the mercenary killed and so on. Yeah, so ideally, Putin would like to hide all consequences, all negative consequences of this war. He would, I don't know, he wouldn't bury anybody at all, you know, if he could. Yeah, it's a strategic question where to bury people.
And another question also related to this is one of the audience members asked about in rural areas or smaller towns where people are conscious of the crimes committed by some of the Wagner mercenaries, that is murders or you know, other violent acts, that they said that there has actually been quite, according to this person, I'm just citing what the person said, that there's been quite a bit of pushback against having funerals there, that they don't want the people to be honored and given a regular burial. They just want them to or a ceremonial burial. They are very conscious of the crimes they committed. Did you encounter that at all in some of your own work?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes. And in fact, my work is still in progress, and I think that the burial ceremony and the politics of mourning is a very important topic for Russia. Yeah, and it's a highly political topic. It's enough to mention so-called the Immortal Regiment March, where the dead veterans of the World War II are supposed to join the living people walking across the street. And yeah, I think it's highly political how to bury a person. Should we bury this person, this killed mercenary, as a hero, or should we bury him as a criminal? That's the question. And in fact, many people, many ordinary people, they don't agree to accept these skilled mercenary as heroes. They don't want them to be buried in their towns or cities at all, yeah, including local authorities. So in this sense, Russian society is divided. Yeah, many people, I would say even the majority of the Russians, are not ready to accept these people. They are not ready to how to say, to incorporate them back into the society. Yeah.
Another question, how do you assess the cult of death that has been fostered in recent months? Statements like Patriarch Kirill saying that if someone dies engaging military service in Ukraine, that all his sins will be expiated, and Putin's own comment about, well, everyone's going to die at some point, so you might as well do it as a soldier, and other such comments. Did anyone bring those up at the funeral or elsewhere? Did you hear much talk about that sort of sentiment?
Yeah, it's a good question. For example, the funeral I has just spoke about was not religious, so there was no priest there, and I wouldn't overestimate the role played by the religion in today's Russia. In spite of all efforts made by Putin and the Orthodox Church, Russia is a country where religion is not very popular. In spite of all, you know, there was an increase in popularity of the religion at the beginning of the 1990s. But now I would say that religion is not very important and influential in Russia, even though Russian Orthodox Church is a powerful and rich organization. Yeah, but again, just like the majority of Russians are not believers at all. Yeah, and so, and especially educated people, they are not believers. And, you know, I wouldn't consider religion as an important factor in the Russo-Ukrainian war, and including in propaganda. Yeah.
Okay, let me, the next question. Thank you for the honest talk. How do you see Russia's future after the end of the war? What are the worst case scenarios and the best case scenarios you anticipate?
Mm-hmm.
So Russia's future after the war, basically.
Yes, everybody in Russia asks this question, and it's a very complicated question. And what we can say is that the way back to democracy will be very difficult and long. Yeah, what Putin is doing now, you know, will impact Russia's future for sure, and the process of rehabilitation, I would say, it could take many years, maybe several decades, and it will be very difficult to resolve the problems created by Putin and his regime, unfortunately. Yeah, and I'm sure that after the fall of Putin, which will happen, of course. The next generation of politicians will not be democratic. This will not be Democrats, unfortunately. Yeah, I believe that we will have another government, not democratic, but this government, it will be like a kind of, I don't know, it will be an intermediate, how to say, step towards democracy. We will not be able to have democracy immediately after Putin's fall, unfortunately. And I think that indeed, but anyway, we just need to wait until the situation changes. It's very important. Yeah, whoever comes to power after Putin, it will be another regime, I'm sure. It will be a different political regime. So they will, how to say, they will have another political opinions, and they will have another policy in relation to Europe and in relation to the West, in relation to the Ukraine as well. Yeah, whoever comes to power, he will stop the war in Ukraine, I'm sure. Even if it is military officer, even if it is a military putsch, never mind. I'm sure that people who will come to power will stop this war.
Let me ask you, the man at the funeral who got irritated when you asked him about the tensions between the Wagner Group and the military, which again, I think anyone who's been watching over the last few, 4 or 5 months cannot deny there is clearly very deep tension between the Wagner Group, especially Prigozhin, and the military. Did other people at the funeral talk about that? And if so, how did they assess that? That is, what do they think Prigozhin wants?
Yes, it's a good question, because, as this funeral took place, it meant that Prigozhin won this fight. With the administration and the military, in a sense. The fact itself to organize this funeral, the fact itself that that officers and soldiers from the official Russian military were sent there to show salute, it was Prigozhin's victory. But I'm sure that Prigozhin is not very powerful, and he is on bad terms with everybody, with local authorities, with high military officers, with the Ministry of Defense. So he's in conflict with everybody. And I'm sure that, of course, his fall will follow very soon. And I'm sure that he has no political future, I mean, Prigozhin, because there are much more powerful persons interested in the fall of Prigozhin. And as a political figure, Prigozhin has no future, I'm sure, even if he managed this time to impose his will, he managed to have this his mercenary buried in St. Petersburg. It's just, it means nothing. I'm sure that Prigozhin has no political future.
And I think we have time for one more question, Denis, which this again goes back to the generational divide. Did you find your students were mostly alienated from the political situation in Russia? That is, a sense that Putin, who's now 70, and most of the people around him are either late 60s or in their 70s, Patrushev and others. Did you find that your students were mostly alienated from the political scene? Did they feel that young people can actually make a difference in Russia? I say that because, as you know, there have been hundreds of thousands of Russians who have left Russia over the last year, almost entirely because of the war. Some who were going to be mobilized or had certainly felt that they would be. So Putin has referred to those kinds of people as scum and traitors. That is, he believes that the society is I think the way he phrased it was, it has undergone a certain self-purge or self-purification. And so I'm wondering, do young people feel that they can still get ahead? The sorts of young people you were dealing with, intelligent students at your university, do they still feel there is a future for them in Russia, or do they in fact feel that they really do need to look for options in other countries?
Yes, it's a very good and important question. It's hard to imagine how frustrated Russian educated young people are. Most of them understand very well what is happening. They are against this war. And if you have a look at people who spoke out against the war, who came to anti-war protests, all of them, 99% of them are young people. These are students of the best Russian universities. But the problem in today's Russia, that they don't have access to power, to political power. They are not allowed to participate in political life. They are totally isolated from the political scene. And most of oppositionary politicians during the last recent years were young people, were very young, even very young people who were, 20 years old, 21 years old. And most of them, of course, they were not allowed to participate in in more or less important elections, like presidential elections, of course, yeah, but they were allowed to participate in some less important elections, and they were allowed to be elected like municipal deputy, yeah. And for example, in St. Petersburg, there were a number of very, very young people working as municipal deputies, and they were very effective, very smart, very good people, really good people, yeah. And all of them spoke out against the war. And unfortunately, after the beginning of the war, most of them had to flee the country, yeah. So why I'm saying all this, I think this illustrates very well what is happening in terms of political life on the generational level. Indeed, young people in Russia are not allowed to participate in political life. They are, and it's a form of discrimination, in fact. It's a form of discrimination.
Okay, we have reached the end of our time, Denis. Several people, or quite a few people, have written into me to ask me to thank you on their behalf. They admire your courage and your intelligence in thinking through these issues. Let me mention that Denis will be at Harvard in the fall, and so that will be announced on the Davis Center website and the Harvard calendar. And I look forward to welcoming him in person. But for now, let me thank him very much for an excellent presentation today. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mark. I'm really thank you for having me, and I was really happy to have this conversation. And indeed, I hope to be at Harvard in person in the fall. Yeah. Thank you, Mark.
Good.